gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Unfiltered. I'm your host, Chubbs McFarlane. I much appreciate the perspective we have the opportunity to learn from one another. Our stories are powerful and can lead into the world. It took a pandemic like this for us to think.
I have focused on using my art as a tool.
Because the opportunities are vast.
Because we have a crucial moment on which to engage in that study right now.
We want more people on board for justice, equality, and liberty. Welcome to Unfiltered. Let's get started. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Unfiltered. Thank you so much for joining the show. It is a lovely Saturday evening. We are thrilled to be back, and we have a fantastic guest here with us this evening, and we're going to have a thrilling conversation. So thank you all for joining once again. And as we normally say on this show, the views and opinions expressed on this show do not represent the views and opinions or beliefs of my employer or the employers of the guests who come on this show. So let's get started. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our guest today. Our guest is Thania Vega. And they go by they, okay? Just so you know, they go by they. Thania Vega is a Latinx queer trans person living in Toronto. Thania is a PhD candidate in political science whose radical vision stands out, even among the leftist hotbed of York University. Their research focuses on the social construction of skilled and migrant nurses working as personal support workers. They are a member of the editorial collective of Upping the Anti, a journal of radical theory and action, and a tireless unionist and social activist, seeking to expand benefits in the workplace and solidarity in the fight for better post-secondary sector. They also seek to enrich the post-secondary sector as a course instructor. Since 2016, Thania OT, as we call them, has taught criminology to undergrads, particularly focusing on deconstructing understandings of crime and criminal. In today's episode, we will be discussing the social construction of crime, the idea of crime, and how what we criminalize is more often a reflection of power rather than the harm posed by criminalized acts. Canadian stats on policing of panhandling as opposed to wage theft demonstrates how criminalization emerges from an underlying ideology that is embedded in news coverage, education, and the overall judicial system. So, without much ado, ladies and gentlemen, I will bring you Thania Vega. Let's let her in. Hey, how's it going?
Hi, how are you? It's going well.
Oh, you're looking good. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. Without much ado, I've introduced you to our audience. I want to hit right at it because we have quite a lot packed into this topic for today. I'm not even sure if we're going to go through all of it, but we'll do our best to cover a lot of the material that we have. But tell me a little bit about the work that you do teaching criminology to undergrads and how and why you believe it is important for the current context of abolitionism.
Okay, so first of all, you can hear me. Oh, it's all coming through, right?
Right, yes.
Okay, good. So I've been TAing criminology at York for the past 3 years. And, I've TA'd different subjects over the years, whether it's been like Canadian or American politics, and I joined them for different reasons. But criminology has always been my favorite course because it's interdisciplinary. So it allows me to engage with like the students who, a lot of the students in the program come because they want to be lawyers, they want to be cops, they want to be forensic investigators, or maybe because they thought the program sounded interesting. So they come from different backgrounds with different intentions, but it allows me to challenge using an interdisciplinary approach, challenge their beliefs about crime. And so the way the course is structured, it invites students to think critically about the law, to learn about systemic racism, about capitalism, about the way the media reproduces like a false but ultimately very dangerous narratives about criminality. And so now that the calls to defund and abolish the police have become a lot stronger, I think that my students are very well prepared to engage in these conversations and, with people around them. Because even though abolitionism isn't even on the syllabus, because criminology, the way that the course is taught, it allows them to unpack dominant ideologies about, about our current criminal justice system. I think it enables them to, think about why reforms aren't working and why more fundamental change is needed.
Just so our viewers understand what we are talking about when we talk about abolitionism, could you flesh out that concept of abolitionism for us?
Yeah, so there's obviously many different definitions, but generally, abolitionism emerged first as the movement to end slavery, but now it's used to refer to movements and like political commitment that seek to end our punitive criminal justice system, which is, in a lot of ways a continuation of social relations to slavery, right? And so this would involve, from ending laws that are meant to defend the interests of the powerful and the rich at the expense of like public well-being. And also to ending, the institutions that enforce those laws, whether it be the court system or the police especially. So, because of deep entanglement between the criminal justice system and other sort of modes of oppression, such as like patriarchy, colonialism, white supremacy, ableism, abolitionism recognizes or rather calls for the need for other oppressive movements to also be like meaningfully tackled, right? Because all of these things are interconnected. So that doesn't mean that like abolitionism calls for everything to be collapsed into abolitionism, but that we understand how these different oppressive forces and beliefs have historically shaped, again, the development of laws and the institutions making and enforcing those laws. As well, as criminology shows us like how we understand deviance and crime, who the criminals are, what causes crime, and ultimately our societal reaction to it.
Thank you very much. By the way, I was going to tell you Happy Pride Month. I know that it is a moment where there's a lot of things happening. We've had a historic ruling coming down from the Supreme Court in the US, which affects people of the community, of the LGBTQ and trans communities. And also, we have a lot of, sort of the push against anti-Black racism going on at the same time in society. So it seems as if all of these equity-seeking groups are sort of convalescing together on all these various fronts on different issues, but that are being pushed to the forefront. So anyways, I just wanted to acknowledge that. I don't know if when you guys or when Pride is celebrated over there, but I just wanted to acknowledge that. So you've talked a little bit about quite a lot of things, abolitionism. You've talked about the intersections of the criminal justice system, policing, oppression, the powers that created society in the way we are. What kind of societal relationships does the current criminal justice system perpetuate or create?
Right. So, I mean, I think it's important to understand, like right now in our criminal justice system, crime means a very specific thing, right? So crime is like defined as like, it's a prohibition against a certain conduct. And there's like a penal sanction associated with it, such as like a fine or imprisonment. And these prohibitions and the sanctions are outlined in like federal, provincial, territorial statutes, or like they're derived from judicial decisions, right? So right now, what we understand is like crime, it doesn't encompass all of like deviant and harmful behavior, but it basically just includes things that we consider illegal, right? So then how does something go from being deviant, right, or maybe harmful to be considered illegal, right, or like a crime in that sense? So, I mean, often people assume that the law, like what we consider legal or illegal, is a matter of like societal consensus, right? So either the result of like a majority of people deciding on this, or like the rational deliberation of like politicians and experts like judges and lawyers, and that over time as a society, we have decided that certain behavior shouldn't be permitted. And so we, made them illegal, right? Or even, some people think it may come from God, right? So like, thou shalt not steal, for example, right? But actually laws don't develop that simply, right? Like a lot of laws are actually the reflection of who was in power at the time, the behavior that those particular people consider immoral or harmful, and it would involve regulating or controlling that behavior. And also something that the law would be a reflection of something that would serve their interests. So let me give you like a very particular example, right? Like if you go and steal a loaf of bread from Loblaws, even, because you're hungry, for example, you have no money, you're stealing a loaf of bread, that you will be very likely subject to an immediate negative interaction with the criminal justice system, right? You'll be arrested, maybe put in jail, whatever. But then if Loblaws inflates the price of bread, which they have done over like a decade, right? Which costs the average consumer something like $400 like over time. Their punishment was to give you a $25 gift card, and because they came forward, they were granted immunity, right? So, I mean, there's a class action lawsuit against them right now. But again, this highlights how like stealing is not the same for, the little guy as stealing as when the corporation does it, right? So again, so then the criminal justice system then creates this like societal relationship of like, there's an inequality, right? Between, where the powerless, especially poor and racialized people, are subject to the law. And, wherein powerful people who cause harm basically get away with it, right? And it also is like, it sets up a system of antagonism between people, right? Because it doesn't seek to reestablish any sort of harmony or healing between the offender and the victim. Instead, what it does is it just punishes the offender, right? In this very punitive way. And it doesn't care about reintegrating that offender into society. And ultimately, it doesn't really do anything about preventing further offending, right? All it does is it threatens more punishment. But, as I can discuss, I can explore on this a little bit more, it actually doesn't work. Like higher penalties, more punishment actually doesn't work in preventing crime.
There is a lot to unpack there, and I'm going to take some time, but I just wanted to point out the last thing you said about higher penalties don't work. Could you give us a little bit of an introspection into what we see south of our borders? Because, they have some very, very high penalties. We have situations where people are sentenced, to prison for 100 and something years, right? So is that sort of what you're talking about when you say, you know, the highest penalties, you know, maybe doesn't really have that deterrent effect that people often think higher penalties would have? That's also something that has happened around discussions around the death penalty. So maybe talk to us a little bit about that, and then I'll bring to you my other questions, which touch on the intersection of, you know, lawmaking, but also the oppressive forces in society, and also their foundations within economics, because you've talked about capitalism, and I want to touch a little bit on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, just to the really quick question of the empirical evidence against higher penalties. Yeah, like there's a lot of data that has been collected over the years that shows, for example, that states that have capital punishment, they are not seeing any less rates of homicide, right? Or of like a violent crime. Same with states that have like 3 strike laws, for example, like California, like, or mandatory minimums, which also exist in Canada. Like those things don't actually, it doesn't actually prevent anyone from committing more crime. Like, and there's like tons of data showing that over time that has been the effect, right? And again, like this really goes to a real misunderstanding of like what causes crime, I would say. I don't know if that's, I think that's answering part of your question, but then you wanted to ask something else.
Right.
If you could clarify that. Yeah.
Yeah, so that answers my question. The other part I wanted to ask was, okay, so if all of these oppressive institutions of society have their foundation in the economics of how society came to be, say we have a capitalist system, you just talked about how the powerful might get a different form of justice than the little guy. You talked about how loblaws could get away with, you know, issuing a coupon for something, for inflating the price of bread. Meanwhile, if somebody were to shoplift bread, they probably face, you know, something stiffer. So my question to you is, do we have to go back and revisit the very foundations of our society, that is the economic system in itself, capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. We need to go back to, you know, like our current system is very much like, it goes back even further than like the start of capitalism, right? Like you can see the influences of a lot of like Judeo-Christian tradition on our current system today. So, you know, and I think if you will allow me sort of like to take you a little bit on this historical trip, because I think it's really important to clarify, it clarifies like misconceptions, not only about what crime is, but also about why people commit crime and subsequently what we can do about it, right? Yeah. So, you know, so prior to these legal definitions of crime and a state to like enforce these laws in a more sort of systematic way, you know, people were, of course, living in societies and they were concerned with deviance, with harm, with wrongdoing, right? And so in religious teachings, particularly in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's 2 very powerful explanations for this sort of sinful behavior, right? One of them is temptation, and the other one is possession, right? So temptation is rooted in this idea that like people exercise free will, but they're allured or they're tempted by like the devil or sort of evil spirits. And so people who succumb are morally weak or inferior, or they're going to risk eternal damnation for this. And this explains, at least at the time, it explains to people why the poor and the destitute, you know, are being held for their misery. And so this idea of like temptation provides the basis for deterrence, which is still very much the model that we use today. So is this idea, going back to your previous question about like more severe punishment, is this idea that the threat of more severe punishment is going to be enough to persuade people not to engage in like evil deeds, right? So that's the first one. And then the second one is possession, right? So wrongdoers are suspected of being taken over by evil spirits and thought to have little hope of recovery, right? So they were treated very harshly, and they would be basically tortured until they would confess their crimes. And so, you know, as we're coming into the Enlightenment, which is very much around the time when like capitalism is forming, right? You know, the Enlightenment is supposed to challenge these ideas of religion, right? It's supposed to replace these superstitious beliefs with more naturalistic explanations. So one of them is this idea that like humans are free, rational beings who enter a social contract. You know, they relinquish some of their individual freedoms in order to, you know, receive some sort of like security and safety from the state, right? So this is where the classic theory of crime emerges from, right? So it again forms the basis of our system today. This theory argues that people break the law to advance their rational self-interest, right? So if it suits you and you can get away with it, you will break the law, right? So that deviance is a rational, calculated activity of trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, right? So this is sort of like a shift away from supernatural demonic explanations, but it's just sort of layering on top of it. It's not really replacing it, right? Especially because women, racialized people at this time are still very much considered as not having the capacity to reason, right? So there's that level. But there's also, you know, it was also supposed to replace like more cruel and inhumane forms of punishment by introducing this idea that the punishment should fit the crime, that it should be severe enough to, again, deter the individual criminal and also other people more generally, to deter them from committing crime, but that it couldn't be too severe that it would be perceived as a violation of the social contract, right? So like it's supposed to be a little bit more measured. And it also has these ideas that like punishments should be swift, so it should be like not too long after the act, and it should be more certain, right? That the law should be very clear and simple for people to understand. So this is representing a shift away from the actor onto the act, right? That people would be judged based on what they had done rather than who they were, which at the time was a very progressive idea because it was meant to not give preferential treatment to those in wealth and power. And, you know, we still, like our criminal justice system is very much based still on this idea, although right now it allows a little bit more flexibility to account for, you know, extenuating circumstances. But it ultimately still continues to rely on this very simplistic view of human behavior, that crime is basically a bad choice, right? And so you prevent crime by increasing the cost of committing crime, right? Via these harsher sentences, you know, which will make people, you know, think twice about committing crime, right? That's very much the idea that like if we offer these really harsh penalties, that's gonna make people think twice, right? And this may work for some, mitigate some behaviors. Like if you think about like why you don't park in front of like a fire hydrant, for example, and instead go pay the $10 parking fee, it's probably because you don't want to have that, face that penalty of like, what is it, $300, $500, right? So it might work for things like that where there's like very multiple easy choices available. But when it comes to other things such as like, you know, drug addiction, for example, theft, assault, right? Like people are not engaging in these very simple rational calculations. That's not what's driving their behavior for the most part. And again, the data shows is that like more severe penalties has not deterred people from committing more crime. In fact, it's just packing more people into prisons. So that's like one of the ideas, right? Like that crime is a bad choice. You're making a bad choice. The other one, which is still very powerful, is this, it came from this idea, it's still very much connected to this idea of like possession, right? That like there's something wrong with you, right? And this, before it was, you know, there was the devil was in you, but as we are, you know, the Enlightenment's coming around and these ideas of like Darwinism, there's this school called the positive school of criminology, which, you know, basically concludes that identifying criminals was a matter of searching for moral or physical traits of less advanced human beings in like evolutionary terms, right? So there was this prison physician named Lombroso who would look for these physical signs of atavism, which is like a signs of an earlier state of evolution. So he would basically look at the prisoners and measure their skulls, their jaws, their ears, the distance between the, things like that, right? Other physical attributes. And he would also observe behaviors such as like, were they promiscuous? Were they idle? Did they have these irresistible cravings to evil, right? And so he would conclude that propensity of criminality, you could identify it based on those observations, right? But obviously, he came up with, you know, what we now would consider really ridiculous conclusions that like 30 to 40% of anarchists had these like particular physical attributes that made them prone to criminality, right? So as you can imagine then, if you are then born a criminal, it means that you're beyond rehabilitation, right? So all that is left to do is to identify you and to incapacitate you in some way. So it's either through segregation, which is incarceration, sterilization, right, to prevent intergenerational criminality, or you would be channeled into something useful, like really dangerous, difficult labor, right? So like a labor camp. So again, even though he said that like, yeah, respectable civilized men commit crimes, you know, those were really rare and no punishment was needed because, you know, those people wouldn't commit crime again. That was just like a matter of like passion or honor or political belief. But, you know, so he could say that we could like basically look at people's bodies and identify who the criminals are. And so you can imagine that like these perspectives have been pretty much refuted today, but they're still very powerful because there's still this trend in criminology to explore criminality as located in like individual bodies, and that it's a matter of like psychological or like chemical sort of like problems or deficits, right? And this is exemplified by this idea that criminals are psychopaths or that they have some sort of antisocial personality disorder, right? So these studies are a little bit more sophisticated now, you know, and they may focus on they're not looking at the size of your ears, but they're looking at personality traits such as impulsivity or aggression, you know, and they use MRI scans, things like that. And they also, you know, place a greater value on like environmental factors. But these studies are still pretty much plagued by the same problems. They tend to be done on people who are already in prison, which is misleading because you're not gaining information about people who commit crimes. You're rather just gaining information about people who have been convicted, right? So it's just people who got caught, basically.
Right.
And they also confuse correlation and causality. So they assume that people committed these crimes because there's something inherent to them that made them commit these crimes, right? So they would put someone in an MRI machine and say, oh, a certain part of your brain lights up when you see an image of violence, right? And we're seeing that people who are in prison, the same part of their brain is firing up in this particular way when they see violence, right? But that doesn't really tell us whether, you know, their response to violence was something that they were born with, or rather because over time they've been exposed to so much violence, this is a way that they have learned to cope with it, right? So you don't really know where this is coming from. And worse than this, like these individualistic explanations for crime, these biological, psychological explanations for crime, they're very dangerous because they use, in the US, they're still using this, and it's outlined. There's this documentary called A Measure of Evil that came out in like 2005. And it talks about the Psychopathy Checklist, which is just a checklist that says like, you're a psychopath if you get, you know, 15 out of 20 or something like that of these traits. And they use this test on prisoners without their consent, without their participation. Like they literally just look at their case file and they determine the probability of recidivism and therefore their access to her rehabilitation and parole based on their score. But again, a lot of like what the thing is measuring is just whether they got caught. doing a crime, rather than like whether they have a propensity to commit crime.
Okay.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. So
Go ahead.
you've talked about quite a number of things, but thank you for that historical context, because I think it's important for our viewers to make the connections as to how we have evolved in our view of crime and punishment and criminality and all of that. So when you were talking about all of that, essentially I was thinking, aren't we essentially living in a high-tech version of the 18th century legal system then? Hasn't all of the technologies, as you mentioned, just taken what used to be and amplified it now in a high-tech version of what we think are new forms or ways of assessing criminality and treating it? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't really come really far, right? Like history doesn't move in this sort of like linear way where things keep getting better and better and better, right? Instead, history tends to be more like a spiral that like keeps coming back on itself a lot, right? So like very much still, these two key ideas of like crime is bad choices and crime is, you're born a criminal. They're both form the basis of our system today because they're very individualistic, right? They don't take into account any sociological reasons, like any social factors, like poverty, for example, alienation, as to why people may commit crime. They also just treat the law as this like objective universal reality, right? That like these laws exist and anyone who crosses them is a criminal. Rather than like understanding, again, as I mentioned earlier, that the law is actually more complicated than that. And it's like a reflection of who is in power, right? And so, I think that, everyone commits crime. Everyone is a criminal, right? Like, I think it's important to start with that idea. And like the professor I like assist at York, he does this amazing exercise where he makes everyone stand up. He reads out a bunch of like, prohibitions based on like the Criminal Code of Canada. And basically is like, who has done any of these? And by the end of it, like everyone is sitting down except maybe two people, right? So it's this idea that like everyone commits crime, everyone's a criminal, but only certain people are targeted for these crimes. They're like, the police is only located in certain neighborhoods. You see them at Jane and Finch, at Queen of Sherborne. You don't see the police on Bay Street, looking at white collar crime, corporate crime, for example, even though white collar crime, like it's way more harmful, at least in economic sense, than like street crime. There's this statistic by, according to like the FBI, white collar crime accounts for nearly like $1 trillion a year of crime, compared to street crime, which is only like 15 billion, right? So that's a huge, that's like a huge gap of like who's actually committing the harm and who's actually being persecuted for it, right?
Yes. So just to follow up on something you said. So you said the laws are pretty much a reflection of who's in power, who's in control at the time. Situate that in the context of this time. We are now in a moment where there is activism on all fronts. There is calls for social change within the whole context of the criminal justice system, whether it's beginning from the police or policing to, the way, black bodies or, women or people from the LGBTQ community are treated within the criminal justice system, even to the extent of people with mental health issues, how they are treated, how they are perceived in society. So situate for us the context. Is this the time where we can see a change that is not necessarily driven by by the wealthy and powerful who are in power, but that comes from a reflection of what society wants, as you see demonstrated in all of this protest action that's taking place all over the globe?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are living in a very obviously horrible time, but also it's very exciting to see that the large amounts of people who are engaging in these questions and like engaging them in a very critical way, right? Like I never thought in my lifetime I was going to see abolition being discussed on the CBC, right? But I think it's because like we have come now to a time where like people have seen that like reforms are not working, that having more Black and like people of color, Indigenous people of color being in the police, that's not really, that doesn't mean that they're being less racist, right? So like that body cameras are really not doing all that much to prevent any sort of violence, right? So I think, people are engaging with these issues in a very critical way, in a way that like is calling for very fundamental change that is not just about like better policing, but it's actually about like, wait a minute, why are certain activities being criminalized to begin with, right? Like why is, for example, the big one is the war on drugs, right? Why are we treating drug addiction as a crime rather than as like a public health issue? Right? Why are we looking at, laws around like vagrancy laws, loitering? Why is it that someone standing around in a corner, like loitering, why is that a crime? Right? Mm-hmm. And then not only that, where does that even come from, right? Like loitering, obviously, existed in Victorian England, but like it exploded after the end of slavery as a way to ban Black people from certain spaces. Mm. Right? So like people are like looking at this in a more fundamental way and seeing like, no, we need to start from scratch. We need to start from the way that our laws are being made, why we're criminalizing certain kinds of behavior. And, the police are just the enforcement of all of that. Mm. And just having better policing doesn't do anything about those unjust laws, basically.
So why don't you, can you comment on the pitfalls in community policing and, something called the Karen effect? I don't know if you're familiar with that, but...
no. Mm-hmm.
So can you comment a little bit on that? Some of the pitfalls in policing as it currently exists, and how, there's a lot of talk about community policing. You've talked about this idea of abolitionism. Some people say defund the police. Some people say, disband the police. But really, can we have a functional society without law enforcement?
Okay, so I think that it's important when we say abolish the police, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be any laws, that everyone's just going to do whatever they want and no one to like any sort of control. Like I think people immediately go there, right? There's just going to be chaos, right? But like that's just not, like police hasn't always existed and it's not always going to exist, right? Like it exists at a very particular historical period. And yet laws and norms are like things that have existed in like many types of societies, right? But deviance has not always been dealt with in the same way, right? So we have not always responded to deviance with punishment. And punishment meaning this very like, it comes from the Latin word, which means pain. So we haven't always dealt with it in this very punitive way, right? So, again, so like just to be able to answer that question, I think it's like important to like really emphasize like what actually is a crime being committed right now, right? Like obviously in the media is going to focus on like these very sensational forms of crime, right? They're going to focus on the serial killer. They're going to focus on, homicide. They're going to focus on like very violent forms of crime. But actually like crime, like it's, I have some, just give me a second, I have some numbers here.
Yes, I was going to ask.
Yeah, so like, for example, and this is still like based on police reports, right? So most police reported crimes, around like 79%, are non-violent property crimes, right? So these are defined as the intent to gain property, but they don't involve the use or the threat of violence, right? So like 79% of these are non-violent, right? And then when it comes to violent crime, which is either the application or the threat of the application of force, that only makes up a very small percentage of crime. And this actually has been, in fact, in decline since the 1990s. And then from that, so imagine violent crime is a very small percentage. And from that, most of that violent crimes, around 60% of it, it's classified as what's known as like level 1 assault, which is, it means it resulted in little or no injury. So for example, someone just shoving you, pushing you, that's a level 1 assault. So majority of violent crime is that. When you're looking at things like very violent crimes like homicide, for example, it only makes up like 0.2% of police reported crime, right? So that's one thing that like we have to, like this idea that like, what are we gonna do with the murderers? Well, that's actually just a very small amount of the crime that's actually being, reported and dealt with in the criminal justice system. In the context of abolition, of course, we're still going to need, some sort of like rapid response team or investigative units that are dealing with these kinds of crimes, right? But they're not going to require the levels of like obscene budget that they require right now, like $1 billion, over $1 billion for the Toronto police budget, right? And even then, like if you look at, serial killer, Bruce McArthur in Toronto, who was killing mainly gay men of color for God knows how long, apparently decades, the police didn't catch him for decades. The community was, kept telling the police there's a serial killer who's targeting us, and the police did nothing about it. So even now they're not doing anything about those kinds of crimes, right? And there's, that funny documentary, Don't Fuck with Cats, about these civilian investigators who found the serial killer, also Canadian, and they kept telling the police, this guy is a serial killer, and the police didn't believe them, right? So it seems that like in terms of investigating homicide and preventing homicide, the police is already not doing anything about it. And that's not to say that we can't have, or we should not have, some sort of organization that deals with those kinds of things, right? So of course we're gonna have that, right? And we're always gonna have like, crime is and crime I mean in terms of like causing harm in a society, there's always going to be people causing harm. Like everyone causes harm, right? Like we're not perfect human beings. We're always causing harm, whether it's intentional or not. And we need to have systems in place to hold those people accountable, right? To bring justice to the victims, to bring community, to bring harmony to the community. But again, the criminal justice system doesn't do any of that. In fact, it makes the problem worse by just shoving people into prisons, right? There's that Angela Davis quote that says, prisons don't deal with social problems, they just disappear people or something like that. They disappear human beings.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Isn't it fair to say that that is a simplified characterization of the criminal justice system? Because if we accept, as you have beautifully explained, the complexity of human beings and human character, and also the complexity of the construction of crime, media has their own perceptions that they create out there. Society has its own perceptions. Then the people who are actually making laws have their own interests that they want to put in there. So if you take all of that, you see that it's all very complex. And then the people that are set, the institution that is supposed to make sense of all of this and ensure the protection of society, but also balance that with the freedoms that people need, is the criminal justice system. So is it fair to just say that, the criminal justice system just, shoves people in one way? Isn't the criminal justice system a reflection of all these complexities? that is why it operates the way it is. It's not a perfect system. What are your thoughts on
Mm-hmm.
that?
Well, I think that obviously the problem of why people cause harm, why people deviate from norms, those questions are very complex because it involves, humans do things for many different kinds of reasons. But so your question is that like the call for abolitionism is, overly simplistic, I'm guessing, right? But I think it's like what it's saying is that it actually is saying no. It's not simplistic because of this, because it's saying it's in fact recognizing that complexity. It's recognizing the complexity of why people commit crime, for example. It's saying that it's not just a bad choice that can be dealt with more severe penalties. It's not just a matter of like evil, psychotic people, right? But that it's actually the result of like multiple forces at play. Whether it's poverty in the case of like someone stealing because they need money, or even in the case of white collar crime, right? So like first, like disavow your idea that only poor people commit crime. Like that's just not the case. Like white people and white rich people and rich people of all colors, they commit a lot of crime, but that crime is just systematically ignored, right? So the criminal justice system is not dealing with any of that. And it's also not dealing with any of the other kinds of like harms that are happening. Like that person stealing that loaf of bread, it's not, preventing that person from falling into poverty. It's not, in terms of someone who commits sexual assault, it's not preventing that person from committing sexual assault again. In terms of domestic violence, it doesn't prevent domestic violence from continuing to happen, right? Again, because its view of crime, it's very simple. It's either bad choices or bad people. But abolitionism is saying, no, crime is a more complex, and the law, these are more complex issues. And this is why we need to engage in abolitionism, because we need to start from the beginning. We need to start from like very fundamental places that take this complexity into account. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. So again, that makes perfect sense. So when we critique the criminal justice system, is it fair to say that we should also appreciate the complexity that such an institution needs to be built up in order to address the complexity of the of the crime that it seeks to address, or the persons that come through the system that it seeks to address, whether it's for rehabilitative purpose or whether it's for punitive purpose, or whether it's a mix of both. We shouldn't just criticize it as as being blind to this complexity, but that it is in recognition of this complexity and trying to address it, that it gets itself tied up in a lot of the inefficiencies that we see or that people criticize. Is that fair?
I mean, there is a level of like, in the courts, there is a level of like judges attempting to deal with this complexity, right? Like when they're looking at an offender, they are taking into account various extenuating circumstances, right? Like, is this their first offense? Do they have a history of being convicted or arrested? In terms of intent, right? Like liberal law, that's why homicide, for example, it's treated as like, whether it was intentional, whether it was an accident, right? So like it does take into account some of this complexity, but ultimately what it does, it sets up this system where like, justice is a matter of like finding out who is guilty, and who is guilty is that particular individual in front of you, and their guilt is based basically upon like, you know, how well can they argue or defend their innocence, right? But again, but it locates the guilt, all of the guilt and responsibility on that particular individual, right? It may take into account extenuating circumstances when it comes to sentencing, but ultimately is like that individual's fault, right? But crime is not the result, is not an individual, it's not the result of again, bad or stupid individuals, basically. It's actually a social problem. But the courts cannot deal with those social problems. They're not made to deal with those social problems. Like in the case of someone stealing a loaf of bread because they're hungry, they may find them guilty or innocent. They might even say, fine, you're guilty of that crime, but we decide to not sentence you because, you know, you're poor, whatever, right? They'll give you maybe some community service or something like that, something that's less punitive, right? So they may be able to do something like that. But again, they're not dealing with the cause of the crime, which was poverty, right? Because again, the criminal justice system is not meant to deal with those sorts of problems.
Okay, so
that makes sense, yeah.
So that's very, very clearly explained. So then the question becomes, should we be pointing to more other culprits of this construction of crime and criminality other than the criminal justice system? Because the criminal justice system relies on legislators, you know, to make the decisions about what are the laws, how we deal with XYZ within the context of that system. You know, those legislatures also make decisions about how society operates, like, whether people who cannot make ends meet are taken care of in terms of social assistance at a level that would prevent them from going to steal that loaf of bread, right? So all of these things. So should we and given the times that we are in, where there is a rise and people are pointing at, say policing specifically, or the criminal justice system, should there be a more concerted effort to talk about governance as a whole of societies rather than picking, one institution versus the other?
Yeah, and this is why abolitionism is intersectional, right? It calls to examine these larger forces, again, of like governance, right? Like this is why it's like, like poverty is not, just a result of the lack of a social safety net, right? Like, I mean, that does contribute to it, but ultimately it goes even further than that. It goes to the question as to like, why is it that the only means by which someone can survive in society is employment, right? So basically, if you don't have a job, you end up on the street and die of hunger or whatever comes with it. Like, that's just like, that's the basis of capitalism, right? Like it creates poverty as a way to force people to accept lower and lower wages, right? So this is why abolitionism asks us to challenge capitalism. In capitalism, I mean the particular system that we have right now, where very few people own, the means of production, meaning they own the factories, they own the technology, the patents, the land, the resources. Very few people are the only ones who control that. And the rest of us, the only way that we can access the means of survival is by like selling, our bodies, our time, everything for a wage, right? But that ultimately is a relationship of like asymmetry, because it's always going to be unequal. And so then from that perspective, crime then is a result not only of poverty in that case, but also of criminalizing activities of survival. So when people can't access employment, what do? They you know, maybe they engage in other more quote unquote illegal activities, sex work, you know, the drug trade, asking people for money on the street. Like these are all activities of survival, and they're all crimes, right? So you sort of like, people are caught between this rock and a hard place. It's like, I can't find a job, but also the things that I'm doing to survive are illegal.
Yeah.
Right? And that doesn't even get to the question of like, prisons are like a money-making business, right? Like from the building of the prisons to now in the United States and in Canada using prisoners for their labor, right? Like slavery is still basically legal if you do it to prisoners.
Yes, and that's you know, like I said to our viewers at the start of the show, there is a lot to discuss. We've had a lot of discussion in the back, and there's just not enough time to unpack all of the different intersections of things within the context of crime, criminality, and the construction thereof. So I'm happy that even though we're going at a quicker pace, you're touching on all these things. But I wanted to come to this issue of prisons just for a quick second to tie back to something you talked about, which is capitalism. So in a sense, basically, we see, as we said, that the whole system started from the economic foundation, which is, you know, whether you talk about slavery as having coming from capitalist origins, again, you talk about the prison industrial complex, you know, would be for-profit prisons as another form of institutionalized slavery today. So why are we then, as citizens, taking comfort in trying to pick and choose what institutions within the framework of capitalism we take our grievances to? Why can't we just attack capitalism as it is, and you share your thoughts on that, and try to upend the system, the capitalist system itself?
Well, so basically, like, why are we focusing on something like abolish the police, right? As opposed to like abolish capitalism? Is that kind of like the question?
That's kind of like
well, you know, because like again, like capitalism is a you know, it's an economic system in the sense that like we all participate in it, and it's like it's historical and it's global and it's grand, right? Like obviously, in terms of like our values and our strategy, our aim has to be eliminating or this type of economic system, right? Because of all the things that come along with it. But in terms of tactics, right? Because you have to think tactics and strategy. In terms of tactics, having something like defunding the police, I think is, you know, a brilliant tactic because it gets at something that is it's very practical, it's very immediate, and it will have very like substantive, it would bring about really huge substantive change, right? Like immediate change to the lives of people, right? But we still have to, again, think defunding the police is just a tactic. It's just one element of abolitionism, right? Like we can't just stop at like 10% cuts and that's it, right? Like we need to still think about like the gradual disintegration of the system, right? Like we still have to think that is ultimately our goal. But in terms of tactics, because the police are they're in the front lines, you know, they are killing people basically, and because, you know, they're sort of like the soldiers of like protecting the law of like private property, right? Which is what capitalism is based on, right? This idea that like, this is mine and no one else can touch it, even though this is mine is like a building that no one is using, and no, you can't live in there because it's mine, right? So like defunding the police, I think is like a brilliant tactic because it's like, it's very immediate. It's going to bring a lot of like immediate change, but it's still very much, you know, engage with this larger strategic goal of challenging capitalism.
Right. So let me just throw one thing in there and see what your response is. So
Yeah.
if for example we say that's a tactic, what happens if say we defund the police, which again, as you identified, are on the front lines. They provide an essential service. I mean, we understand the excesses, but they still provide a service that helps a whole segment of society that wouldn't be able to come up with the resources to provide those services for themselves if left on their own, right? So if you, for example, defund the police, and then the more wealthy individuals, which we also acknowledge, form a good number or have a whole, own about, 60% of the world, of the world's wealth is owned by 1% of the population. So if those individuals decide to now contract private securities for their own, protection of property, safety, and all of that, where does that then leave, the rest of the population?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple premises there that I would challenge. Like, I would challenge the premise that that the police protects people. Like, I think the police protects a very particular, a very small segment of the population, and it only protects them from very particular kinds of harm, right? So, it will, again, using private property, there's a case in some state in the United States where nurses try to take over this empty hospital to be able to take on more patients with COVID. This hospital it's there, it's built, it's perfectly something that we could take and use, right, for the public well-being. They take it over. What happens? The police comes and takes them out, arrests them, says you're violating, you're trespassing, right? How is the police protecting anyone's well-being in that case? They're protecting the well-being of the particular owner of the hospital, right? They're not protecting the well-being of the nurses, of the public, of, the COVID patients, right? So I just challenge this idea that they're providing protection, right? Yes, a lot of the times they're the only service that we can call, right? If we see someone having, there's a fight that breaks out, or, there's a break and enter, or there's a traffic accident, they are the first responders. They're often the only people that we can call. But again, that's by design, because other services are not funded or they're not available. Right, so that's part of the defunding the police is reducing that scope increasingly and giving it to other organizations that deal with those problems in a more meaningful way, right? And then when it comes to the privatization of the police, I mean, this has been brought up, this idea that if we defund the police, the rich are still going to be fine because they're going to be able to hire private police officers. I don't really see the distinction right now between the police and a private at least security force. They basically function in the same way. You could say that the police should theoretically be more accountable to the public because we use our tax money to pay for them, but in practice, that doesn't happen at all. The SIU, the Special Investigations Unit, which is supposed to be the body that holds the police accountable. If you look at the data, they're not doing that, right? The most police officers get away with misconduct, right? And part of that is the SIU. A lot of that has to do with the unions that are protecting them, right? So where is the public accountability when it comes to the police now?
Very, very, very interesting points raised. And certainly, like I said, if you are tuning into the show, viewers, this is Unfiltered, and our guest here is Thania Vega, and we are talking about the construction of crime. We've touched on criminality. We've touched on, capitalism. We're talking about abolitionism. This whole idea, trying to make sense of, how it can be valuable in us achieving a more equitable society and world going forward. And there are really some interesting points that we're hammering home. Our time is fast running out, but I wanted to, give you a chance also to talk about certain things that we haven't had a chance to talk about, which is some of the work or research that you are doing around migrant nurses. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean, and I can connect it to the conversation that is happening now. So basically, my work looks at migrant nurses, mainly from the Philippines, who come here. The classic immigration story of like highly educated people coming here and not being able to work in their field, right, in their profession, and they end up working as like taxi drivers, or in the case of my research, as personal support workers, which are like the frontline workers of in healthcare right now. And they're also the lowest paid of all the healthcare workers. They make close to minimum wage, right? And yet they provide the bulk of the care, right? So my research is basically looking at the sort of hierarchy of healthcare provision, right? So you have obviously doctors at the top, and then you have registered nurses, registered practical nurses, and the rest, right? Whether it's personal support workers, healthcare aides, dietary aides, all of these people again who provide the majority of the care, who are with residents or patients for most of the time, and who conduct some of the most dangerous work, right? They're the ones who are, feeding people, lifting them, bathing them, dealing with their feces and their pee, right? So they're very much like at the front lines of providing care, yet they are the most undervalued of all the healthcare workers. And so if you look historically, the way that sort of hierarchy emerged, it's very closely tied to the devaluation of work done by women and done work by Black, Indigenous people of color, right? So before, in like, just a quick history here, the nurses, when it first emerged as a profession, used to provide all of the care. And they still do this in various countries, right? Like the nurse would be the one making the bed, dealing with your shit, dealing with your bed, with your feeding, all of that. And they would also be the one giving you medication, all those kinds of things, right? As the profession, because mostly women were nurses, as nurses try to gain more recognition so that they could get better pay and those kinds of things, what they ended up doing in that process of professionalization, right, of becoming like registered nurses, what they ended up doing was they gained that recognition by increasingly distancing themselves from those activities that they consider to be beneath them. Mm. So activities like cleaning someone's shit or feeding someone or making their bed, right? But obviously that work still needed to be done. So then who did it? Poor people, women of color, right? And so then now, if you take that, the fact that like nursing became a powerful and better paid position, it was at the expense of those people, right? So what you have now is basically this hierarchy of skills where like we consider mental work or skills that were gained in like formal education settings, right? Like university, for example, we consider those more valuable. and therefore more worthy of like more pay and benefits and security and those kinds of things. Whereas work that we consider quote unquote unskilled, like manual labor, for example, we consider that less worthy, right? But there's no reason why that hierarchy of skills needs to exist, because all the labor that is provided is valuable and it's necessary and it's skilled in its own way. I don't know if you ever tried to bathe someone with dementia and trying to convince them that you're gonna undress them and you're gonna like give them a bath. That is like a level of skill that you would never gain with a university education, right?
I agree.
But we know that we don't consider that skill. We don't pay for that. We don't, you know. So, but again, why is that? So then I look at the historical factors of that, and very much closely tied with racism, you know, patriarchy, those kinds of things. So that's the elevator pitch, I guess, of my research. Yeah.
That is quite an interesting research, and it seems like you can never get away from the whole capitalist foundation of
No, you can't.
We're talking about hierarchies, and I'm sitting here just listening to you, and I'm thinking, wow, capitalism really did us a number. In everything.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. I know that we had quite a lot that we could talk about. Even our flyer for this episode had a lot of different things there. We haven't even touched on, you know, this whole notion of deviancy and how it intersects, or how you can differentiate it from, you know, criminality or criminal acts, because there's a lot of deviancy in society today, some of which is accepted, some of which is criminalized. So, you know, there's so much, but we would love to have you back, T, on the show. We would have another expanded episode where we can touch on some of these topics. But thank you so much for coming. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your research and your perspectives. I really, really much appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I think this is really valuable, and yeah, obviously we can't cover everything, but hopefully it gave some people some food for thought. So thanks for that opportunity.
Right, and I would very much like to extend the invitation that you come back, because it doesn't seem as if what we're dealing with in the global world right now is going to go away anytime soon. I think, you know, we're going to see more protest action, more systemic change being demanded of institutions. And so we want to be having that conversation in real time as these events are unfolding, and get people's perspectives and invite others with different perspectives to participate in the conversation. Hey viewers, like you see, we didn't agree on everything, but we had a great conversation. So
yes,
I'll be extending an invitation to you as we delve into these various areas. Thank you so much to all of our viewers.
thank you so much.
Please share, invite others to like. Next week, we would have another great show next week. On the history of science and a number of things in that milieu. We are almost wrapping up season 1. And at the end of this month, we will wrap up season 1 and prepare ourselves for season 2, which should have a lot of fireworks. Thank you, everybody, for joining this evening. See, you have a great evening up there in Toronto. Have a lovely evening, everyone, and good night.
Night.
I'm your host here, Jeff McFarland. Welcome to Unfiltered. I'm your host here, Jeff